Chapter 15, Extermination, Africa. The road to the Holocaust began in Africa. I believe that the Aryan nation should be exterminated, announced German leader Lothar von Trotha in 1904. The Aryan, a Bantu people, lived in what is now the southwest African country of Namibia, and has been fighting against the German settlers in the area. Trotha arrived with 10,000 men to crush the opposition. He hemmed the men, women, and children of the Aryan on three sides, leaving them only to escape through the deadly sands of the Kalahari Desert. Then he poisoned the water holes the desperate Aryan would pass. When the word of the Trotha brutality reached Europe, he was ordered to stop, and about one of every 8 Aryan managed to survive. But an anthropologist who arrived from Germany at the height of the Trotha's death march liked what he saw. Dr. Eugene Fischer was certain that the natives were subhuman animals, and though it made sense that the survivors of the Trothan campaign should be housed in intermediate camps, destroying Africans was not enough for Fischer. For Fischer was convinced that children who had African parents were a danger to white race. He set out to prove by studying the children of legal marriages between men of Europe background and native women. His conclusions were devastating. The Africans were inferior, and they passed on their deficiencies to even their mixed children. Fischer insisted race mixing must be prevented. How? Inferior race should be kept alive only as the beast of burden, otherwise they must be destroyed. Madison Grant said that the unfit should be obliterated. Fischer went a step further, arguing for the elimination of the entire race. Among the races he thought were weakened whites only through intermarriage, he listed Africans, Jews, and Gypsies. His reputation greatly enhanced by his studies in Africa, Fischer was soon hailed in Germany as the best expert on the dangers of race mixing. That made his work ideal reading material for a strange, unappealing man who, when he had a stage and a microphone, transformed it into a most compelling speaker. The man was a prisoner named Adolf Hitler. Mein Kampf. 2 words faced one another, the men of God and the men of Satan. The Jew is the anti-man, the creature of another God. He must have come from one another, root of the human race. I set out the Aryan and the Jew over against each other. Hitler was one of those weird, isolated men who could read occult books, who hung around on the edges of the fanatical organizations, who could not hold a job but had a wild gleam in the eye. No matter that he was a school dropout, a failure, he believed he had found the secret of the universe. Actually, there were 2 secrets, exactly as Gobineau had said. Race was the key to everything, exactly as Chamberlain argued. Jews were an alien species that must be removed, so that the pure Aryans could fulfill their destiny. The most extreme versions of the Iranianism spoke to Hitler in a seductive voice that was perfectly suited his temperament. He shared that the Christian view of the Jews as the men of Satan. He agreed that the Jews' enemy, Gobineau and Chamberlain, mixed in the storylines which heroes from the ancient Norse myths were destined to reappear. Like a modern loner who hears messages beamed directly to him in the most extreme music, Hitler heard Wagner's operas not as art and fantasy, but an outline of his and Germany's future. Powerful, purposeful, filled with rage. Hitler saw himself as a prophet, a hero with flashing swords. None of this would matter very much. Surely there are some people today mumbling on chat rooms about their insane causes. But the last swing of the German seesaw was so extreme that Hitler's mad intensity drew people to him. In the early years of the 20th century, Germany was England's rival as the dominant world power. A powerful, self-confident country, immensely proud of its fine universities, its brilliant composers and fearless army. Germany was essence of a modern nation, and the environment. Jews were so prominent that they served in the government. In the 1914, the Crown Prince of Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated. There were so many fragile alliances in Europe, and the empires ruled by European nations covered so much of the planet that this act plunged the entire world into war. When the World War I began, Hitler was so excited. He actually gleamed. He loved the idea of fighting for Germany as many others did, Jews and Christians alike, but the war ended with devastating defeat for Germans. Just as they were rising to the glory, Germans were thwarted at the cost of 2 million lives. How could this have happened? Two of those believed that the race inferiority. There was one compelling answer: traitors. False Germans must have sold out the nation. And who could those traitors have been? It must have been the people who were able to subvert the nation and make out well themselves. It must have been the internationals who had no roots in the soil of the blood of the nation. Parasites who sucked the life out of the real Germans while their true alliances was only to one another. It must have been the Jews. Jewish bankers profited from the war. Jewish manipulators who pulled secret strings through immensely wealthy families' connections, wily Jewish politicians who traded away the honor of the pride of Germany, who were the villains. These were the villains. After the war, cosmopolitan, optimistic Germany, in which Jews were full citizens, seemed like an illusion. The truth of the great German people again having their faces ground in humiliation by the hated French, while the Jews crackled and counted their money. This was the picture Hitler painted, and it struck very deep chords with some Germans. He spoke of their nightmares, and they listened. But Hitler got ahead of himself. In November of 1923, he organized his followers to try to take over the government by force and failed. Although he served in just 11 months of a 5-year prison sentence, he used his time well. He read avidly and dedicated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, to his ally, Rudolf Hess. The book was an autobiography, also a manifesto. The very paper on the book was written and linked Hitler to what he saw as his destiny. Richard Wagner's daughter-in-law brought the paper into the prison to serve his hero she so admired. Hitler's wide reading of the literature of the race took him directly to the English Fischer. Fischer told Hitler what to do about Jews. Through Fischer, Hitler added eugenics and Iranianism. Jewry is without question a race and is not a fellow religious fellowship. He said in his books, the effect of Jewry will be racial tuberculosis of nations. This was the fatal step in the future of the most advanced race required careful eugenic management, then inferiors must be destroyed. If Jews were such a corrupt and harmful race, then what we must fight for is to safeguard the existence and the reproduction of our race to our people, the substance of our children, and the purity of blood. The fate of the hero pushed to die in the desert was only a reasonable future for the Jews. Mein Kampf brought together every variety of hatred I had described in this book. In 1924, the same year as America shut its doors to the Jews, Hitler was released from prison, carrying his message of race and war and extermination. It took Hitler 9 years to get out of prison to be elected of government. But he was duly elected just as the American public fully supported the immigrants' restrictions. As we look backward into German vote, seems impossible to believe. How could smart people elect a madman? But at the same time, his views were very popular, just as Americans were letting eugenics sterilize women who were having the wrong kind of children. In Susan Cooper's wonderful fantasy, The Dark is Rising, she says, the powers of the dark can do many things, but they cannot destroy. They cannot kill those of the light, not unless they gain a final dominion over the whole earth. But what if they do rule the whole earth? What then? The Holocaust. Early Americans needing to be especially alert in dangerous environments, divided into the world, into us and them, friend and foe. Sumerians changed at the civilized and savage, which Greeks modified to Greek barbarian. Romans created new tiers dividing people by wealth and background and vastly increasing the pool of slaves. Christians claim that all divisions disappeared when compared to difference by God and humanity. But then the Crusaders slaughtered infidels and monstrous men, even as encountered with new people, shook the religious certainties. A new division arose. Race seemed to be divided people more firmly than ever before, since each person's capabilities were set by his or her parents and grandparents, and remote ancestors by the 20th century was no longer a personal matter. The health of nations depended on maintaining absolute purity. With the rise of the deathly race theory, the West faced a stark choice to recognize the murderous insanity of these ideas and reject them, or it could be put into practice. When Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he set out to make Germany racially pure. Hitler shaped Germany into a modern nation with efficient employees, advanced systems of transportation, effective ways to communicate with people over long distances. For a very long time in history, a large state, a nation, and a real capacity to perform a gigantic eugenic experiment. Hitler termed this carefully planned slaughter the final solution to the Jewish problem. The end. Hitler plunged the past sanity, past humanity, past reason, and built death camps that were hell on earth. Trains brought in victims, gas chambers killed them, ovens burned their bodies. Under Hitler's guidance, Germany and soon all the other states he conquered in Europe set out to rid of the world of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, the mentally. Prejudice was no longer belief, it was genocidal policy. Hitler managed to murder 6 million Jews and with a similar number of others. Some 2 out of 3 Jews who had lived in Eastern Europe. The dead deserve silence. If I put away my history books and look inside my heart, I am not interested in explaining Hitler or understanding the Germans. My emotions are not that tolerant or kind. The Germans can never feel guilty enough to suit me. There is no end, no parole. They should cringe, they should crawl and beg for forgiveness forever. My hatred should never have to be curbed by their apologies or pavements. I resent what they are now and prosperous. That they make great cars, that their banks are stable and their skies are blue. I resent their successful soccer team and the fact that the crowds even can go to games and enjoy them. I resent every bite of the food they savor. The normalcy offends me. Be humble, I want to say to Germans. Be quiet, stay out of my sight. Of course, that is exactly what some Christians have felt about Jews whom they blame for killing their Savior. Perhaps, too, is what some African Americans or Palestinians feel toward me. Those who treat other subhuman looms as inhuman selves, that makes them terrifying. But what is also that make them very hard to forgive? Hatred is the scar victims carry, and I am not sure it could ever heal. And yet Germans did not act alone. Hitler's law allowed anyone to have hatred, the people he targeted to act on those prejudices. The millions shipped the death camps from conquered nations of Europe were a collective portrait of their neighbors' beliefs across the Atlantic. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew for certain about Hitler's death camps, but his mailbox was filled with pleas not to go to war over Jews. Too many Americans believed that if the Jews were being persecuted, they must have deserved their fate. Just like the Civil War veterans chose to not ignore the rising of lynchings. Americans who regretted having been drawn into World War I were determined to not be sucked into another conflict. If blacks were being killed, they must have been provoked the whites. If Jews were being killed, they must have brought it on themselves. Hitler's choice was victims was perfect. Although Americans did not murder Jews the way Europeans did, they do confine 1,110 Japanese Americans to intermediate camps. Japanese American citizens who had lived in America and who had been born in the U.S. citizens what lost. it had taken a lifetime to build, the Japanese Americans were not only people of their liberties limited during the war. A few thousand Italian Americans and Germans living in America were so put into camps. 600,000 Italian citizens were kept under close watch. Governments in wartime do need to be cautious, especially after the surprise attack like the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor. Why did all the West Coast Japanese Americans come under the suspicion, but only a small minority of the Italian or German Americans were nationwide? Enough Americans were prejudiced against all Japanese, all Asian, even enough Americans did not care. While Japanese Americans were being told to be held prisoners, their husbands, brothers, and sons went off to fight. Many served in the 422nd Combat Unit, which received more combinations of expectational service than any other similar division in the history of American warfare. They were perfect soldiers in defense of a nation that was treating their families as criminals. This paradox, in which the victims of racial prejudice served their country with distinction, happened with all too frequently during the 20th century. When President Woodrow Wilson led America into World War I, for example, he said the war was to make the world safe for democracy. At the very beginning of the war, Annie Besant, an Englishwoman who had lived in India for many years, wrote a letter to the leading newspaper in England making a case for a people who did not have a voice of their own government. Is the Indian, she asked, never to free among free men? Is it never to be estimated by his character, his brain, and all his heart, but always be the color of his skin? She returned to India, where she worked to help India gain its independence. Though Americans saw the English as their main allies and fight for democracy, the English had no interest in listening to Besant. After the First World War ended, the English chose to keep in the place highly restrictive laws that curtailed the rights of the Indians in India. 1 million Indian soldiers had fought for England and British Empire during the World War. Their sacrifice accomplished nothing at home. An Indian lawyer named Mohandas K. Gandhi, who had been deeply influenced by reading Henry David Thoreau's book on civil disobedience, urged Indians to protest against the laws, but the British saw the Indian resistance as the beginning of a rebellion. To crush the Indians, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer led a detachment of Indian troops to shoot down their countrymen. On April 13, 1990, Dyer's men opened fire at the gathering of the 20,000 Indians. At least 379 were killed. Serving an empire built on the idea that the whites were meant to rule over inferior races, Dyer thought that he had done exactly the right thing. Though it might seem surprising, Gandhi did not condemn Dyer. The officer Gandhi explained that one act he saved English lives and the empire. Gandhi recognized that the road of Indian independence came from understanding the English as fellow human beings, even as the English treated Indians as inferiors. But while he did not condemn Dyer as a person, Gandhi encouraged Indians to not cooperate with the English in any way. In effect, that they were to act as they were already independent. In America, after the World War II, those determined to maintain white rule were more subtle than Dyer. 7,000 black Americans served in the war. All of them segregated units. All too often, the officers put in charge the black soldiers were Southern whites. White Americans had learned that the message of the birth of the nation, only the sons had Confederacy, really know how to manage blacks. On the home front, blacks were shut out of working any good factory jobs in the defense industry. Even as to build plans to attack the Nazi Germany, a company in Kansas announced that its jobs were only for white Americans. The parallels between murders in the name of the race in Europe and discrimination based on similar race ideas in America continued through the war. One of the most cruel and inhuman aspects of the Holocaust was undertaken in the name of science. Since prisoners in the German camps were not considered human, doctors could not do anything they wanted them to do. For example, Nazi doctors experimented with plunging people into freezing water to observe the damage to them, and it determined how best they could recover. Their aim was to develop the great way German pilots whose planes were shot down in the cold North Sea. The prisoners suffered horribly. Their screams were so loud that the doctor asked to move the study from Dachau to Auschwitz, where he could have more room and others would not hear them. Americans were sickened when they learned of these experiments, but it was similar taking place here. It started in 1932, continuing for 40 years after that. And the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study in which medical researchers observed the notes and took notes as 399 black men in Alabama suffered through the late stages of syphilis. The patients were never told about their condition, which meant they were in effect their wives and children. This Tuskegee experiment was not designed to help doctors cure the disease. In fact, a cure was to develop the test that was going on and was never given to men. The test produced no valuable scientific information. In 1997, President Clinton officially apologized for the government's role in conducting it. As with Hitler's election, the Tuskegee experiment seems horrifying now, but when it was taking place to fit the reigning racial beliefs, indeed, perhaps as the long-lasting damage of American racism during the war was hidden in the best laws approved. Passed in 1944, the GI Bill of Rights was a marvelous idea. At the only time of 1% of Americans went to college, the GI Bill offered free college education to returning soldiers, which led directly to America we live in today, where a college education is both a necessity and a norm. But racists had never liked the idea of blacks going to school, not during slavery, but when it was the defeated federal funding for education, the Blair Bill of the 1800s, and the 1944. They manipulated the GI Bill so that all white Southern governments would control their funds in states, shutting out of the majority of black soldiers from getting college scholarships. When Leo Frank was lynched in 1915, a happy, smiling crowd gathered to look at his swaying body. Lynchings were so popular that they were advertised in the newspapers, postcards, and were printing off the showing, eager faces of women, children, men, all excited to see another body manipulated, strung up. Who would have sent such a card? Who would have been happy enough to receive such a greeting? Every one of those people was in effect part of the lynching mobs. One of these people, the Holocaust was like one of those postcards. While we see the image of the Nazi death camps, we were actually looking at the portrait of the world and was being believed in racial rankings, sustained by glazing guns and discriminatory laws.